American soldiers in North Africa and later in Europe often spoke about the shock of seeing German Panther tanks move in ways that did not seem possible. They would appear suddenly on the flank, cut through supply lines, and then vanish again, only to strike from another direction. To men on the ground, these tanks seemed to act with one mind. There were no flags being waved, no runners dashing between vehicles, no signals that could explain such fluid motion. To Allied eyes, the precision of these attacks felt almost supernatural. What those soldiers did not know at the time was that the secret lay inside the Panthers. Each one carried a radio that allowed tank commanders to speak with each other in real time. Orders did not have to travel slowly up and down the chain of command. They did not have to be relayed by visual cues or by guesswork. A German officer in one Panther could direct the fire of his whole platoon in seconds. A company commander could adjust the movement of dozens of tanks at once. This was the hidden weapon that gave the Panther its fearsome reputation. The American and British troops who faced these attacks often misread what they were seeing. They thought the Germans had trained to a level of discipline no other army could match. In truth, discipline mattered, but the real advantage was invisible. It was the ability to talk across the battlefield at the speed of voice. Radios allowed tanks to shift direction without breaking formation. They could concentrate fire on a target that only one crew had spotted. They could retreat in an orderly fashion instead of collapsing into confusion. The stakes of this hidden advantage were enormous. Blitzkrieg, the German style of lightning war, depended on speed. If armored units could not act together, the entire idea would fail. A tank alone, no matter how powerful, is just a target. A group of tanks moving without communication can be ambushed and destroyed. But a unit of tanks tied together by radios could strike like a single weapon. They could react faster than the enemy, overwhelm defenses before they had time to adjust, and exploit every weakness. Imagine if German tanks had not been equipped with radios. Blitz attacks would have slowed down or fallen apart. Orders would have been delayed. Platoons would have advanced into danger without knowing what lay ahead. Infantry support would have been scattered and artillery fire would have lacked coordination. The Germans might never have achieved their early victories in Poland or France. Even the Panther, with its strong gun and armor, would have been far less effective. Without the ability to coordinate, it could not have carried out the swift maneuvers that gave it an edge. For the Allies, the price of ignorance was high in the early years of the war. Units were overrun in hours, sometimes in minutes, by German formations that seemed to anticipate every move. Entire defensive lines collapsed because the defenders could not match the speed of enemy coordination. In many cases, Allied tanks had no radios at all or only carried receivers. This meant they could hear orders from above but could not report back. German tank crews, by contrast, could exchange information freely and make instant decisions. The shock of facing such coordination left a deep impression on those who survived. Reports from the front often described the Germans as having uncanny timing. Soldiers wrote about Panthers that struck from one direction while another group cut off retreat. They marveled at how the enemy seemed always to know where to apply pressure. It took time before Allied intelligence began to understand that the real key was not mystical skill but technology. Radios inside the tanks were the unseen force that held these maneuvers together. The hook of this story is simple. The Panther was feared for its gun and armor, but its greatest strength was something soldiers could not see. The radios inside each tank allowed German crews to act as one, creating the illusion of a machine that fought with a single mind. For the Americans and British who faced these attacks, the discovery of this truth came late. By then, the price had already been paid in blood. The stage was set for a clash not only of weapons, but of communication, and the outcome would shape the rest of the war. The roots of German radio coordination go back to the years before the war. One of the strongest voices in favor of communication was Heinz Guderian. He was convinced that tanks were useless if they could not work together. A single armored vehicle might destroy a target, but victory required groups moving as one. For this to happen, they needed constant contact. Guderian insisted that every tank should have a radio, and he pushed for this as early as the 1920s. At that time, most armies did not take the idea seriously. Tanks were still new, and many officers thought of them as slow armored wagons. Communication between vehicles was handled by flags, hand signals, or runners carrying notes. These methods had been used in the First World War, and little had changed by the 1930s. Radios were large, unreliable, and expensive. Most countries placed them only in command vehicles, if at all. The crews in ordinary tanks were expected to follow the leader by sight, a system that broke down as soon as smoke or terrain blocked the view. German engineers worked to solve these problems. They developed the Fug series of radios, which became the backbone of armored communication. The most important of these early sets was the Fug 5. It allowed both transmitting and receiving and became standard in many German tanks. Others like the Fug 2 were receivers only and were placed in vehicles where full two-way contact was not considered vital. These sets worked on amplitude modulation and used frequencies in the 27 to 33 MHz range. By the standards of the time, they were advanced and reliable enough to survive the rough conditions inside a tank. The technical side of the radios mattered. They used about 10 watts of power and had a range of several kilometers when conditions were good. This was enough for communication between platoon leaders and company commanders. The radios used simple controls so that soldiers with little training could operate them. Antennas were fitted to the outside of the tanks and became a common sight on German vehicles. This also meant that command tanks could often be recognized by their multiple antennas, which made them tempting targets for enemy gunners. As these systems became more common, German tank units trained to use them in ways no other army had attempted. Instead of moving in rigid lines, they practiced flexible maneuvers. A platoon could split in two, one group pinning the enemy while the other circled around. The leader could give orders in seconds, and the whole formation reacted at once. In exercises, these tactics produced stunning results. They convinced Guderian and others that the future of armored warfare depended on communication. By the late 1930s, German tank doctrine was shaped around this idea. Blitzkrieg, the lightning war, was not only about speed but about coordination. Radios were the nervous system that tied together tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft. The armored thrusts that shocked the world in 1939 and 1940 would not have been possible without this foundation. When German engineers put radios into their vehicles, they were building the hidden framework of their victories. Other nations lagged behind. In Britain and France, many tanks still lacked radios at the start of the war. Crews had to rely on visual signals or orders shouted across the battlefield. In the Soviet Union, the problem was even greater. Most T-34 tanks rolled into combat without radios until later in the war. This made them powerful individually but clumsy as a group. German tanks, even when technically weaker, gained the upper hand by fighting as one body. The creation of the Fug series was more than a technical achievement. It was a cultural shift in how the German army viewed war. It showed that information could be as decisive as armor or firepower. Guderian's vision was becoming real. By the time the Panther entered the war, this system was already in place. The stage had been set for the Germans to unleash a form of warfare that confused and terrified their enemies. Radios turned their armored forces into a living organism that could adapt, strike, and exploit weakness at a speed no one else could match. The first clear demonstration of how radios shaped armored warfare came in Poland in September 1939. German forces entered the country with a mix of Panzer I and Panzer II light tanks, supported by more powerful Panzer III and IV models. On paper, these tanks were not impressive compared to some of their opponents. Polish forces had tanks with heavier armor and larger guns. What they did not have was the ability to coordinate them on the move. Many Polish crews relied on hand signals or pre-arranged plans. If a commander wanted to change orders once battle had started, the message might never reach the men who needed it. German tanks, even the lighter models, had radios that allowed their leaders to adapt in real time. As the campaign unfolded, German formations moved with a speed that shocked the world. Tank commanders could call for artillery support or change direction when they spotted a weakness. A single message could turn an entire column toward a gap in the enemy line. This flexibility made it seem as if the German advance could not be stopped. In truth, the equipment was not perfect and range was sometimes limited by terrain, but the very fact that the tanks could talk to each other gave them a level of control Poland could not match. Within weeks, the country was overrun, and many observers noted that radios were a key reason why. The next year in France, the lesson was repeated on an even greater scale. The French army had some of the most powerful tanks of the period, including the Saumur S-35 and the Char B-1. These vehicles carried thick armor and heavy guns, often outclassing the German Panzer III and IV in one-on-one combat. Yet French doctrine placed radios only in command vehicles. Many tanks went into battle with no way to speak to one another. This meant that once fighting began, units often broke apart, each crew fighting its own private battle. German crews, though often in weaker machines, acted as a single unit. The German invasion of France is remembered for the drive through the Ardennes, a region thought impassable for large armored forces. Here radios proved decisive. When German spearheads found unexpected resistance, commanders quickly shifted directions and concentrated power elsewhere. When a gap opened in the French line, the news spread across entire divisions in minutes. This allowed the Germans to pour through weak points and encircle large enemy formations. The French could not respond with the same speed. Their tanks might win small skirmishes, but they lacked the ability to change plans once battle began. The result was a collapse that stunned the world and forced Britain to evacuate from Dunkirk. Operation Barbarossa in June 1941 brought the challenge of distance. The invasion of the Soviet Union stretched across hundreds of miles. Once again, German radio networks became the glue that held the armored thrusts together. Soviet T-34 tanks had appeared on the battlefield by this time. They were fast, heavily armed, and well-armored, often superior to the Panzer III and IV. Yet many of them entered combat without radios. Crews had to rely on flag signals, which quickly became useless in the chaos of battle. Others had only receivers, which meant they could hear orders but not send information back. The Germans exploited this weakness. Their radios allowed them to coordinate rapid encirclements known as cauldrons. Whole Soviet armies were trapped when German tanks and motorized infantry closed pockets behind them. These victories were not only the result of speed and surprise, but of communication. A German tank spotting an opening could report it instantly. Commanders could direct reserves to exploit it. Artillery and air support could be called in within minutes. The Soviets often did not even know an encirclement was forming until it was too late. Still, Barbarossa also showed the limits of the German system. The FUG radios used amplitude modulation, which was vulnerable to interference from engine noise and electrical equipment. Ranges that looked good on paper were often reduced in real combat. Static made communication difficult during rapid movement. Even so, compared to the near silence in many Soviet units, German radios remained a major edge. The first months of the invasion produced some of the largest prisoner captures in history, in part because of this advantage. For Allied observers, the pattern was becoming clear. German tanks did not fight as individuals. They fought as coordinated groups tied together by a constant flow of information. This made them more dangerous than their technical specifications suggested. A single panzer might not be impressive, but a platoon working as one could destroy larger and better armed opponents. American and British officers studying these battles began to realize that their own armored forces would need similar communication systems if they were to stand a chance. The early campaigns of the war sent a message to the world. Radios were no longer a luxury. They were a weapon in their own right, as decisive as a cannon or a piece of armor. Poland, France, and the Soviet Union all learned this the hard way. German crews using ordinary tanks gained extraordinary results because they could speak and coordinate. This created the legend of the unstoppable blitzkrieg. It was not only a matter of tactics or bravery. It was the invisible power of communication that turned fast-moving vehicles into a weapon of shock and destruction. The stage was set for the Panther, which would carry this hidden advantage into later battles with even greater effect. The Panther tank entered the war at a moment when the German army faced new challenges. In 1941 and 1942, the Soviet T-34 had shocked German commanders with its sloped armor, wide tracks, and powerful gun. German engineers were ordered to design a tank that could match and surpass it. The result was the Panther, officially known as the Panzerkampfwagen V. It first appeared at the Battle of Kursk in July 1943. Although plagued by mechanical problems during its debut, the Panther was quickly recognized as one of the most dangerous tanks of the war. It carried a high-velocity 75mm gun that could penetrate almost any Allied tank at long range. Its armor was sloped to deflect incoming rounds. Its wide tracks allowed it to move across difficult ground more easily than earlier German vehicles. Yet behind these visible strengths was another advantage that was less obvious but just as important. The Panther was equipped with radios as standard. Each Panther carried the FUG-5 transceiver, which operated on the same frequency ranges as other German armored radios. This meant that every tank in a platoon or company could both send and receive messages. Some command Panthers were fitted with additional sets such as the FUG-7 for air liaison, which allowed coordination with aircraft. These systems transformed the Panther from a powerful individual machine into part of a living network of steel. A single tank spotting an enemy position could instantly report it. Within moments, others could adjust their guns and concentrate fire. Platoon leaders could direct movements in seconds, turning what might have been a scattered response into a coordinated blow. At Kursk, even with many Panthers breaking down from engine fires and transmission failures, the impact of their radios was already clear. When they did reach the battlefield, they operated in groups that could shift and adapt quickly. Soviet units often tried to ambush them with T-34s, but the ability to communicate let the Germans regroup under pressure. One Panther might call out a flanking move, and the rest could respond at once. Although the battle itself ended in a Soviet strategic victory, the Allies had seen the new tank in action and understood that they faced a machine designed not only for strength but for coordination. As the war continued, the Panther appeared on both the eastern and western fronts. Reports from American and British soldiers often described the shock of facing them. It was not only the long barrel of the 75mm gun or the heavy frontal armor that made them fearsome. It was the way they seemed to strike in unison. An American patrol might find itself hit from two sides at once, with fire coordinated so precisely that escape was nearly impossible. Infantrymen described Panthers withdrawing from one position only to reappear minutes later in a different spot, as if the tanks could read each other's minds. In reality, it was the constant chatter over their radios that allowed this fluid style of combat. The design of the FUG-5 made it effective at the short to medium ranges where tank battles usually occurred. Although it had weaknesses, including interference from engine noise and limited range compared to the later American FM sets, it still gave German crews an edge over many Allied units early in the conflict. For example, British tanks like the Matilda and Crusader often carried only limited communication equipment. Some relied on a single command vehicle to coordinate actions. If that vehicle was destroyed, the rest of the platoon could be left without guidance. By contrast, any Panther in a group could take over communication duties if a leader was lost. One of the most striking examples of Panther coordination came during the fighting in Normandy in 1944. German forces, though outnumbered, launched a series of counterattacks against American and British units advancing inland from the beaches. Small groups of Panthers used hedgerows and villages for cover, striking suddenly at Allied columns. Survivors often remarked on how quickly these tanks could appear, fire, and vanish again. The key was their radios. Crews stayed in constant contact, warning each other of Allied movements and directing fire so that every shot counted. Even when Allied air power and artillery made German attacks costly, The speed and coordination of the Panthers made them a constant threat. The psychological effect of this coordination was significant. To Allied troops, it often felt as though the Germans had uncanny awareness of their movements. In reality, the Panthers were simply using their radios effectively. If one tank spotted an American Sherman, it did not fight alone. It alerted others nearby, and together they struck from multiple directions. If artillery threatened their position, commanders could order an immediate retreat while keeping the group intact. This created an impression of discipline and unity that went beyond what visual signals or prearranged tactics could achieve. On the Eastern Front, the story was much the same. Soviet units, even by 1943, still suffered from shortages of radios in their tanks. Many T-34s entered battle with no sets at all. Others carried receivers but could not send information back. This forced Soviet tankers to rely heavily on pre-planned formations. When they encountered Panthers, they often found themselves at a disadvantage even if they had numerical superiority. The German crews could adjust instantly, spreading out, flanking, or concentrating fire, while the Soviets struggled to change plans once combat began. Yet the Panther's radio system was not without flaws. The use of amplitude modulation meant static and interference were constant problems. When tanks were moving fast or when electrical systems created noise, signals could be difficult to hear. Range was also limited, often only a few kilometers in real battlefield conditions. This meant that coordination worked best at the platoon and company level rather than across divisions. Still, within those limits, the radios gave German tankers a degree of control their enemies often lacked. The Panther thus became more than a piece of heavy armor and firepower. It became part of a web of communication that allowed the German army to punch above its weight. Every time Allied forces described Panthers moving with uncanny precision, they were witnessing the hidden power of radio. It was not magic and it was not supernatural discipline. It was the ability to share information in real time. For the men inside those tanks, the FUG-5 was as important as the 75mm gun. It was the tool that allowed them to turn a collection of individual machines into a single coordinated weapon. By 1944 and 1945, the Allies had begun to close the gap. American Shermans were fitted with FM radios that offered clearer signals and greater range. British forces also improved their equipment. This reduced the Panther's hidden advantage, but it did not erase the fear they inspired. As long as the Germans could keep their tanks supplied and crews trained, the combination of firepower, armor, and radio coordination made them one of the most formidable weapons on the battlefield. The legacy of this advantage would remain long after the war ended, but during those crucial years it gave the Panther an edge that left a lasting mark on those who faced it. The Panther was a fearsome weapon, but its advantage in communication was not without limits. As the war dragged on, Germany struggled to produce enough tanks and radios to meet demand. The country faced shortages of materials, skilled labor, and industrial capacity. Each FUG-5 radio required specialized components and careful assembly. Unlike the United States, which could turn out tens of thousands of standardized sets, Germany never achieved the same scale. This meant that while Panthers usually carried full radios, many other tanks did not. Panzer IVs and older models often had only receivers or no sets at all. The idea that every German tank could coordinate in real time was not always true in practice. This shortfall had real consequences. German doctrine assumed that each platoon leader had a full transceiver while the rest of the unit might have only receivers. This meant orders could be given, but feedback was harder to collect. A tank spotting an enemy might not be able to report it if it lacked a transmitter. When commanders were killed or vehicles with full radios destroyed, entire formations could fall into silence. The illusion of seamless coordination could vanish in a single strike. In contrast, American production solved this problem by equipping nearly every Sherman with a reliable FM radio. This gave even ordinary tank crews the ability to speak up, warn others, or take over leadership if needed. Doctrinal rigidity made the German problem worse. The army had built its tactics around hierarchy. Orders flowed downward from leaders to subordinates. Subordinate vehicles followed commands but were not expected to act independently. When radios failed or commanders were knocked out, confusion spread quickly. Allied units, especially the Americans, learned to fight differently. They adopted a system where any tank could assume command in an emergency. Radios allowed them to practice flexible tactics. A platoon cut off from its leader did not collapse but carried on with coordination. This adaptability grew stronger as the Allies gained more battlefield experience. The Allies also improved their technology. Early in the war, British and American radios had suffered from problems similar to German sets. They used amplitude modulation and often broke down under battlefield stress. By 1942 and 1943, American engineers had perfected frequency modulation for armored radios. These FM sets cut through static and interference, delivering clear signals even during heavy movement or artillery fire. By the time of Normandy, every Sherman tank carried one. The difference was dramatic. Allied tankers who once felt overwhelmed by German coordination now found themselves able to fight on equal terms. They could call for artillery support, warn of ambushes, and coordinate with infantry in ways that mirrored or even surpassed the German system. For German crews, the war had become more difficult. The Panther was still powerful, but the enemy no longer fought in isolation. Instead, American and British forces moved with coordination that matched their own. Worse, the Allies often had more tanks, more artillery, and more aircraft. Superior communication could no longer compensate for shortages in numbers and supplies. German counterattacks that might once have succeeded were now blunted by quick Allied responses. Reports from the front describe situations where Panthers tried to strike from the flank, only to find artillery landing on their position within minutes. The radios that once gave Germans a hidden edge were now being matched by their enemies. The production issue never went away. Germany managed to build around 6,000 Panthers in total. This was far fewer than the 50,000 Shermans produced by the United States. Each Panther took more time and resources to construct, and its radios were not mass-produced at the same level as American sets. Shortages meant that even as Panthers rolled off the assembly line, other armored vehicles were left without proper equipment. This imbalance weakened the German armored force as a whole. A single Panther might be deadly, but entire formations required communication to function. Without enough radios, the advantage of one tank type could not make up for the shortcomings of the rest. The Allies also found ways to disrupt German communication. Radio direction finding and jamming were limited in effect during the war, but artillery and airstrikes often targeted command vehicles that carried extra antenna. Once these tanks were destroyed, German units had a harder time staying coordinated. Meanwhile, Allied armies used combined arms to greater effect. Infantry, artillery, and armor could all share information quickly through their radio networks. German crews often fought bravely, but they were increasingly isolated. By 1944, the difference was clear. German radios had once been a revolutionary advantage, but now they were outdated compared to Allied FM sets. The Panthers still terrified tank crews who faced them, yet the unseen edge that had once allowed German units to appear everywhere at once was fading. The Allies had closed the gap, and in many ways they had surpassed it. Their ability to mass-produce reliable radios and install them in every vehicle ensured that no tank fought alone. This was a shift that German industry could not match, no matter how advanced their designs were on paper. In the end, the limits of German production and doctrine meant that the Panther never achieved its full potential. It remained a symbol of German engineering with strong armor and a deadly gun, but its radios could not change the course of the war once the Allies caught up. Communication, which had once given the Germans an edge, now belonged to both sides. The Allies, with their larger numbers and better logistics, used it more effectively. The Panther remained dangerous to the very end, but it was no longer the ghostly predator that moved unseen and struck with perfect timing. It had become just another tank in a war now decided by scale, resources, and the ability to keep every unit connected. The Panther gave Germany an important advantage, but its power was limited by production and doctrine. German industry could not keep up with the demands of the war. Radios like the Fug 5 were complicated to build and required skilled labor. While Panthers usually carried full transceivers, many Panzer IVs and older models had only receivers or none at all. This meant that in many battles only some tanks could send reports while others could only listen. If command tanks were destroyed, entire units often fell into silence. The German army also relied too heavily on strict hierarchy. Orders flowed downward, and subordinate crews were not expected to act independently. When communication was cut, units lost direction. The Americans developed a different system. Their Shermans were almost all fitted with FM radios by 1943. These sets were clearer, more reliable, and allowed any tank to assume command if needed. This flexibility gave Allied units an advantage as the war went on. By Normandy, the difference was clear. German Panthers remained powerful, but Allied units could now match their coordination. American crews could call for artillery, warn others of ambushes, and adjust formations quickly. German units that once struck with surprise now found their movements met with fast and organized responses. Germany could never close the gap. It built only a few thousand Panthers, while the Allies built tens of thousands of Shermans with radios in every one. The advantage of communication, once a hidden weapon, no longer belonged to the Germans. The Panther was still feared for its gun and armor, but the unseen edge of radio coordination had shifted to the other side, where numbers, production, and flexibility decided the outcome.